I knew we were in danger the exact second I found the freshly chewed human fingernails scattered across our Airbnb's master bed. My girlfriend Sarah and I had just arrived at a secluded cabin in northern Maine, desperate for a quiet weekend getaway. The drive up had been eerie, surrounded by miles of choking black pine trees and a heavy fog that seemed to swallow the headlights. The cabin itself was old, with dark wood siding and windows that looked like hollow eyes. The owner, a man named Marcus, had left the key under the mat, promising total privacy. But as I stared down at the jagged, bloody remnants on the pristine white sheets, a sickening wave of dread washed over me. This wasn't an accidental mess left behind by a cleaning crew. Someone had been sitting right here, nervously biting their nails down to the quick just minutes before we unlocked a door.
A sudden, violent drop in temperature made my breath instantly bloom into white vapor. Sarah whimpered, pointing toward the heavy velvet curtains blocking the far corner of the bedroom. They were swaying. The cabin windows were tightly shut, and the air conditioning wasn't running. Yet the thick fabric moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Stepping forward, the floorboards groaned beneath my sneakers, sounding deafeningly loud in the dead silence. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I gripped the dusty edge of the curtain and yanked it back. There was nothing behind it but a small, solid iron door built directly into the log wall. It was secured with 3 heavy padlocks, but the terrifying part was the floor underneath. A dark, wet substance was slowly oozing out from the bottom crack, staining the hardwood black.
"We need to leave. Right now," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at the dark fluid. I nodded, not wanting to find out what was rotting behind that iron door. We grabbed our duffel bags and bolted down the creaking hallway toward the front exit. I threw my weight against the heavy wooden door, twisting the deadbolt and pulling the handle. It didn't budge. I tried again, frantically rattling the metal, but it was completely jammed from the outside. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered violently before dying entirely, plunging the cabin into pitch-black darkness. The only illumination came from the pale moonlight filtering through the high windows. Then, the silence was shattered. From somewhere, my hands shook so badly I almost dropped my phone as I frantically dialed 911. No service. The signal bars were entirely gone, replaced by a mocking, searching icon. The heavy footsteps stopped directly on the other side of the living room wall. We held our breath, paralyzed by a primal fear, crouching low behind the kitchen island. In the dark, the sickening odor of copper and wet earth began to fill the air, clogging my throat. Suddenly, a horrific sound echoed from the master bedroom we had just fled. It was the loud metallic screech of heavy padlocks being unlocked, one by one. Click, click, click. Followed by the slow, agonizing creak of the iron door swinging open. A wet, guttural chuckle vibrated through the dark cabin, and a voice whispered from the shadows, "I told you I left the key under the mat." The floorboards directly above our heads groaned under a sudden, massive weight. Sarah clamped both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer terror as tears spilled down her pale cheeks. The wet, rhythmic thudding returned, but this time it was moving across the ceiling, tracking our exact position behind the kitchen island. Whoever or whatever was inside this house with us knew exactly where we were hiding. I gripped a heavy cast iron skillet from the counter, my knuckles turning white, though I knew it offered little protection against the unseen horror in the dark. The sickening smell of copper and rot grew overwhelmingly thick, making my stomach violently churn. Then, the heavy footsteps abruptly stopped right above us. For a long, agonizing minute, there was absolute silence, save for the sound of our own frantic heartbeats. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic scraping sound began scratching through the drywall right next to my ear.
The scratching morphed into a slow, deliberate carving motion, as if someone was slicing through the plaster with a jagged hunting knife. I pulled Sarah closer to me, our bodies shivering violently from both the freezing cold and the mounting dread. Through the wall, a faint, rhythmic clicking sound started up, the unmistakable noise of human teeth chattering rapidly. Then came the whisper. It didn't sound like a normal human voice. It was a raspy, dual-toned wheeze that seemed to vibrate directly inside my skull. "You have such beautiful fingernails," the voice scraped out, followed by a wet, choking gasp. The drywall began to bulge outward right where we were leaning, cracking the white paint. Pieces of plaster crumbled to the floor, revealing a dark, jagged. I scrambled backward, dragging Sarah with me as the skinless finger hooked around the edge of the hole and began tearing the wall open further. We dashed blindly down the pitch-black hallway, seeking any alternative escape route. I remembered a small window in the downstairs bathroom and threw the door open. The room was freezing, the air smelling strongly of bleach and old copper. I lunged for the frosted glass window, desperately unlocking the latch and pushing it upward. It slid open just a few inches before slamming hard against a solid wooden board. The owner had boarded up the windows from the outside. Panic hit me like a physical blow. We were completely bricked into a slaughterhouse. Suddenly, the bathroom mirror behind us shattered into 1,000 pieces. Reflexively spinning around, I saw a dark, towering silhouette stepping out from a hidden panel behind the broken glass. The figure was monstrously tall, its face obscured by a filthy, blood-soaked burlap sack tied tightly around its neck. It breathed with a wet, rattling wheeze that sprayed a mist of dark fluid onto the bathroom floor. In its left hand, it held a massive, rusted crowbar. Its right hand was completely raw, stripped of skin and missing several fingernails. It raised the crowbar high into the air, its frame completely blocking our only exit. Sarah let out a piercing scream that echoed off the cold tiles as the figure took a slow, heavy step toward us. I raised the cast iron skillet in a desperate attempt to defend ourselves, but my foot slipped on the wet floor. As I fell backward, the heavy iron door in the bedroom slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the sound of frantic, desperate scratching began coming from inside the bathroom walls around us. The sound of scratching inside the bathroom walls grew deafening, like hundreds of fingernails desperately clawing at the drywall from the inside. I hit the wet tile floor hard, the cast iron skillet clattering out of my grip. The towering figure in the burlap mask didn't hesitate. It lunged forward with terrifying speed, swinging the rusted crowbar downward toward my head. I rolled frantically to the side, the metal bar smashing into the floorboards right where my skull had been, shattering the tile into sharp shards. Sarah screamed, throwing a heavy bottle of bleach directly into the creature's masked face. The liquid soaked through the burlap, and the figure let out a wet, agonizing shriek, stumbling backward into the shattered mirror. Seizing our only chance, I scrambled to my feet, grabbed Sarah's hand, and bolted past the flailing monster, running blindly back out into the dark hallway. We ran back into the living room, our lungs burning as the freezing air filled our chests. The cabin felt entirely different now. The air was heavy, thick with a choking fog that had somehow begun leaking in through the floorboards.
In the dim moonlight, I noticed that the dark, wet substance oozing from the master bedroom had spread across the entire living room floor, forming a slick, black pool. Suddenly, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. My heart leaped. I pulled it out, hoping against hope for a signal. There were still no bars, but a text message had somehow forced its way through from an unknown number. With shaking fingers, I looked at the screen. It was an image file. The picture was taken from a high angle, looking directly down at Sarah and me, crouching behind the kitchen island just moments ago.
The text underneath the photo read, "Look up." My blood turned to absolute ice. I slowly tilted my head upward toward the high, vaulted ceiling of the living room. Up in the dark rafters, hidden among the shadows of the wooden beams, something was moving. It wasn't the man in the burlap mask. This was something else. A second figure, terrifyingly thin and contorted, clinging to the ceiling like a massive human spider. Its limbs were unnaturally long, bent at impossible, broken angles. It stared down at us, its eyes reflecting the pale moonlight like a predatory animal. Before I could even yell for Sarah to run, the creature let out a high-pitched, mocking laugh that sounded exactly like Sarah's own voice. It uncoiled its elongated limbs and dropped from the rafters, landing heavily on the floor just feet away from us with a sickening...
The spider-like creature stood up, its joints popping loudly in the dark. It lunged toward Sarah, its long, pale fingers outstretched. In a panic, I grabbed the heavy wooden coffee table and shoved it with all my might, crashing it into the creature's legs. It tripped, howling in that stolen, distorted voice, giving us a brief second to sprint toward the kitchen. We slammed the heavy wooden basement door shut behind us, sliding a metal broom handle through the loops to lock it. We were trapped in the pitch black, standing at the top of a steep flight of stairs that led straight down into the unknown. Just then, a heavy blow struck the basement door from the living room side, making the wood splinter. At the exact same moment, a cold, wet hand gripped my ankle from the darkness beneath the stairs. The cold, wet grip on my ankle tightened with a crushing, unnatural strength, pulling me backward toward the edge of the stairs. I screamed, kicking wildly with my free leg until my boot connected with something soft and wet. A sickening groan echoed from the pitch black below, and the grip suddenly released. Above us, the living room door shuddered violently as another heavy blow cracked the wood right down the middle. Splinters flew into the dark hallway. We had nowhere left to go but down. Holding hands so tightly our knuckles popped, Sarah and I flew down the steep wooden steps in total darkness, our feet barely touching the treads. The air turned freezing, smelling heavily of copper, damp earth, and chemical cleaner. We hit the concrete floor at the bottom just as the door above us exploded open, sending a shower of wood and the heavy footsteps of our pursuers crashing down behind us.
We stumbled through the dark basement, our hands scraping against rough, damp stone walls. Suddenly, a flickering fluorescent light tube overhead buzzed to life, casting a sickly green glow over the room. What we saw made my breath catch in my throat. The basement was lined with rows of deep, rusted iron cages. Inside them were piles of bloody clothing, abandoned suitcases, and walls covered in frantic, carved tally marks.
"You weren't supposed to explore," Marcus whispered, his voice a calm, terrifying contrast to his manic expression. Behind us, the spider-like creature and the towering man in the burlap mask crawled and stepped down the stairs, cutting off our only escape route. We were entirely surrounded in the center of the horrific butcher shop. Marcus stepped forward, raising the cleaver, his gaze fixed intently on my hands. Your nails will make a fine addition to the collection. Panic morphed into pure adrenaline-fueled survival instinct. I grabbed a heavy glass jar filled with chemical fluid from the table and hurled it with all my strength at Marcus's face. The glass shattered perfectly across his eyes. He let out a deafening, bubbling shriek of agony, dropping the cleaver and clutching his bleeding face as the corrosive liquid began to smoke against his skin.
As Marcus fell, I scooped up his dropped cleaver and swung it blindly at the spider-like creature lunging from the side, slicing its arm. It howled, retreating into the shadows. Taking Sarah's hand, I noticed a small coal chute door at the back of the basement wall, unlocked and hanging slightly open. We scrambled up the coal pile, forcing our bodies through the narrow metal opening, scraping our skin against the rough iron. We spilled out onto the cold, wet grass outside just as the sun began to break over the horizon. We ran for miles through the choking pine woods until we finally reached a main road and flagged down a passing trucker. The police raided the cabin later that afternoon, but it was completely empty. They found the cages and the fingernails, but Marcus and his monsters had vanished, leaving only a final text on my phone. See you next vacation.